In the summer of 1847, Ireland produced enough food to feed 18 million people. That same summer, 1 million Irish men, women, and children starved to death. In the ditches, in the fields, in the doorways of their own homes. The food did not vanish. It did not rot in the ground. It was loaded onto ships, grain, cattle, butter, oats, and it sailed out of Irish harbours under the protection of armed soldiers, past the crowds of the dying, bound for the tables of England. They will tell you a fungus killed 1 million people. That is a lie. A fungus killed the potato. Something else killed the people. This is not the story of a plant disease. This is the story of a decision, and of the men who made it and called it mercy. Before we begin, if you want the true story behind the food on your table, the wars, the famines, the crimes nobody talks about, subscribe now. This is only the first of them. To understand how 1 million people died, you first have to understand how 8.5 million people lived. And in 1844, Ireland was, by the strange arithmetic of poverty, one of the most crowded places on earth. Picture the west coast. Green hills folding into grey sea. Stone walls dividing the land into plots so small a man could cross his entire farm in 20 paces. On those plots lived families of 6, 8, 10 people, in cabins of mud and stone, with a single room, a hole in the roof for smoke, and often a pig sleeping by the fire, because the pig was worth more than any of them. These people owned nothing. The land beneath their feet belonged to landlords, many of them English, many of whom had never once set foot in Ireland. The Irish rented their tiny plots, and to pay that rent, they grew grain and raised cattle. But here is the cruelty at the heart of it. They did not eat what they grew. The grain and the beef were cash. They went to market, to England, to pay the landlord. If a family ate its own wheat, it lost its home. So what did 8.5 million people actually eat? One thing, a single crop, the potato. It sounds absurd now, but the numbers are real. A working Irishman ate somewhere between 4 and 6 kilograms of potatoes every single day. Not as a side dish, as breakfast, as dinner, as supper. Boiled, with a little milk if he was lucky, with nothing if he was not. An entire nation, from the infant to the old woman, lived on a plant that had come to Europe only 300 years before, from the mountains of South America. And it worked. That is the terrible irony. The potato was a miracle. It grew in the poorest soil, in the wettest weather, in ground too broken for wheat. A single acre could feed a family for a year. The potato was why Ireland's population had exploded, doubling in 50 years, long past what its ruined economy should ever have allowed. But the Irish had made a bargain they did not understand. They had bet the lives of an entire nation on a single variety of a single plant. Not many kinds of potato. One. A fat, watery, high-yielding type they called the lumper. The lumper fed them. The lumper was everything. And everything, when it rests on one root, can be taken away in a single night. There were warnings, if anyone had cared to read them. In 1845, strange reports drifted across the Atlantic. In America, on the eastern seaboard, potato fields were dying, turning black, dissolving into slime, giving off a stench that farmers said they had never smelled before. The reports crossed to Europe, Belgium, Holland, then the south of England. Nobody in Ireland was watching. Why would they be? The summer of 1845 was fine. The plants stood tall and green across the whole island, heavy with the promise of another good year. In the cabins, in the fields, in the market towns, no one felt the smallest tremor of what was coming. They went to sleep that autumn, in a country that had always been saved by the same faithful root. They would wake to something none of them had a word for. Because in the night, carried on the wet Atlantic wind, something had drifted in from the sea, and settled silently over the green fields of Ireland. By morning, the whole country had begun to turn black. The man woke, as he always did, before the sun. He pulled on his boots, stepped out of the cabin, and walked toward his field of potatoes, the field that stood the evening before as green and thick as any he had ever grown. He stopped at the edge of it. He did not understand what he was looking at. The plants were gone. Not eaten, not trampled. Gone in the sense that they had collapsed inward, the leaves curled black and slick, the stalks bent to the ground as if a fire had passed over them without flame. And rising from the field was a smell, a wet, sweet, rotting stench that got into the back of the throat and stayed there. Neighbors came out of their cabins one by one, drawn by the same smell, and stood at the edges of their own ruined fields, saying nothing, because there was nothing yet to say. This was September 1845, and what these people were smelling was the death of everything they owned. They dug anyway. What else could they do? They plunged their hands into the wet earth and pulled up the potatoes, and for one moment there was hope. The potatoes looked whole, looked fine. They carried them inside. They stored them in pits, as they always had, packed in straw against the winter. And then, in the dark of the storage pits, the potatoes began to dissolve. This is the cruelty of the blight that few remember. It did not stop at the leaves. The disease lived in the tuber itself, invisible, patient. A potato could be dug up looking perfectly sound and, within days, turn to black slime in a family's own pantry. People opened their winter stores in October to find not food, but rot. A stinking grey pulp where their entire year's survival should have been. By the end of 1845, roughly 1/3 of Ireland's potato crop was gone. Bad, but survivable. People tightened their belts, sold the pig, prayed the next year would be clean. Some scientists in Dublin insisted the cause was the weather, or static electricity in the air, or vapors from the ground. They were wrong. The truth, a microscopic organism, a water mold spreading spore by spore on the wind and the rain, would not be properly understood for decades. But you did not need a microscope to understand hunger. And then came 1846. If 1845 was a wound, 1846 was the killing blow. The blight returned, and this time it did not take a third, it took nearly everything. Field after field, county after county, the entire island turned black in a matter of weeks. There was no store of good potatoes left from the year before. There was no seed left to plant. There was no pig left to sell. A whole nation of 8 million people who ate almost nothing but the potato watched the potato vanish from the earth completely. The winter that followed was the coldest anyone could remember. Snow fell in the west, where snow rarely fell at all, and into the cabins of Ireland came a silence that the survivors would describe for the rest of their lives. The silence of people who no longer had the strength to speak, lying in the dark, waiting. But here is the thing you must hold on to, the fact that turns this from tragedy into something far darker. Ireland in 1846 was not an empty land. The grain still grew, the cattle still grazed, the butter was still churned. The country was, that entire winter, producing food, enormous quantities of it. Ships sat in the harbours of Cork and Dublin and Limerick, and onto those ships, week after week, went the harvest of Ireland. It just wasn't going to the Irish. Far away, in a grey office in London, a man was reading the reports of the dying with a pen in his hand, and he had already decided exactly what would, and would not, be done about it. His name would change everything. London, the winter of 1846. A grey office, a warm fire, a desk stacked with reports. Outside, the machinery of the largest empire on earth hummed along. And behind that desk sat the man who would decide whether the Irish lived or died. His name was Charles Trevelyan. He was 38 years old, brilliant, tireless, and utterly certain of himself. As the senior civil servant in charge of the Treasury, relief for Ireland flowed through his hands and no one else's. Every shilling, every shipment, every decision about who would be fed passed across his desk. And Trevelyan held a set of beliefs that would prove more lethal than any blight. He believed, first, in the free market, that government must not interfere with the buying and selling of food, no matter who was starving. To feed people for free, he argued, would ruin the merchants, destroy the habit of work, and make the Irish forever dependent. Better, he thought, to let hunger teach its lesson. And he believed something darker still. Trevelyan wrote in his own hand that the famine was a mechanism for reducing surplus population. He called it the judgment of God on an indolent and self-reliant people. Read that again. The man controlling the food supply to a dying nation believed that their dying was, in some sense, deserved. A divine correction to a problem of too many poor Irish. This is the moment the story turns, because a crop can fail by accident, a mold can spread by nature, but a man deciding that the starving should not be fed, that is a choice. And Trevelyan made it, over and over, from behind a desk hundreds of miles from a single empty stomach. His first act was to shut things down. A previous government had quietly bought a supply of corn and set up depots to keep prices from spiraling. Trevelyan disapproved. He wound the program down, insisting that private merchants, not the state, should feed Ireland. But the merchants had no incentive to ship food into a country whose people had no money to buy it, so the food simply did not come. Instead, Trevelyan offered work. Not food, work. The government set up public relief schemes. Hundreds of thousands of starving people were put to labor, building roads that led nowhere, breaking stones, digging ditches that served no purpose. The logic was that they would earn wages and buy food. But the wages were pitiful, paid late or not at all, and there was little food to buy at any price. So the weakest people in Ireland, the sick, the old, the children, spent their last strength swinging picks on frozen hillsides, and then they lay down in the mud and did not get up. There is a phrase from that time, spoken of these roads. They were built by men who were dying as they built them, going nowhere, for nothing. And through it all, Trevelyan's rules held firm. Do not give food away. Do not interfere with trade. Do not let the Irish grow dependent. Reports poured onto his desk, parish priests describing corpses in the ditches, doctors describing children too weak to cry. And he read them, and he did not change his mind. He believed he was doing the right thing. That may be the most frightening part of all. Because the food was there. It was in the harbours, it was on the ships. And now, under the doctrine of a man who never saw the fields, that food was about to leave, while a single, strange cargo was already crossing the ocean toward Ireland's shores. It was not potatoes. It was not wheat. It was something the Irish had never seen before and did not know how to eat. The ships came into the harbour low in the water, heavy with cargo, and the crowds that gathered on the docks did not recognize what was being unloaded. It was not the pale sacks of oats they knew. It was corn, hard, yellow maize shipped across the Atlantic from America. The people called it Indian meal, and they stared at it as if it had fallen from the sky. They did not know how to eat it. That is not an exaggeration. It is the heart of the tragedy. This maize was rock hard, and unlike the potato, you could not simply boil it and eat. It had to be ground twice in mills built for softer grain, and then cooked long and carefully. Ground once and eaten, As starving people did, it tore at the stomach and the bowels. It gave the desperate a new kind of agony on top of their hunger. In some places they gave it a bitter nickname, Peel's brimstone, after the Prime Minister who first imported it, because eating it burned like fire going through the body. And there was never enough of it. The maize was rationed, sold rather than given, doled out in amounts that could not keep a family alive. People walked 10, 20 miles to a depot, waited a full day in the cold, and went home with a handful of yellow grit they didn't know how to prepare. Some ate it raw in the road and doubled over in pain. This was the great relief. This was what a starving nation was offered in place of the food that grew all around it. Because that is the fact that must not be lost. While the yellow meal trickled in by the sackful, the true harvest of Ireland was flowing out by the shipload. Go to the harbours of Cork, of Limerick, of Waterford in these years, and you would have seen it with your own eyes. Wagons rolling down to the quays, piled with oats, with wheat, with barley. Herds of cattle driven up the gangplanks, barrels of butter, casks of pork, sacks of flour, the abundance of a fertile island, loaded onto ships bound for England. In a single year, during the worst of the dying, Ireland exported enough grain and livestock to have fed its starving people several times over. And here is the detail that turns the stomach. In some ports, the food convoys had to be protected. Starving crowds, watching wagons of grain roll past their dying children toward the ships, would surge forward in desperation. So the shipments were guarded by soldiers, by police, by cavalry with drawn weapons. Picture it, a skeletal mother at the roadside, and rolling past her a cart heaped with oats that could save her child, flanked by armed men whose orders were to make sure not a single grain reached her hands. The food and the soldiers moved in the same direction, toward the sea, away from the mouths that needed it. Why? Because the grain was not the people's to eat. It never had been. It belonged to the landlords, and it was owed as rent. The tenants grew it, harvested it, and handed it over, not because they were forced at that moment, but because the alternative was eviction. And eviction in that winter meant death anyway. The law protected the landlord's property to the last grain. The law did not protect the child. So the great engine kept turning. Rent left the land as food. Food left the harbour as export. And back across the sea came a trickle of hard yellow maize that people could barely digest, sold to them for money they did not have. The system was working exactly as it was designed to work, and the men who ran it slept soundly, certain they were fair. But out in the countryside, something was beginning that no policy had planned for and no ledger could measure. On the roads between the villages, a slow, staggering movement had begun. Thousands of people leaving their homes with nowhere to go. And on those roads, the real dying was about to start. They came out onto the roads because they had nowhere left to stay. By 1847, the year the Irish would forever call Black 47, the cabins were emptying, not by choice. When a family could no longer pay the rent, the landlord sent men to put them out, and the law stood squarely behind him. The eviction was brutal in its simplicity. The family was dragged into the open, and then, so they could never return, the cabin itself was destroyed. A crew would attach ropes to the roof beams and pull the whole structure down, or set fire to the thatch, until nothing remained but a smoking ruin and a family standing in the road with whatever they could carry. Hundreds of thousands of people were turned out this way. Whole townlands were levelled, and these evicted families, weak with hunger, had only one place to go: the road. They wandered toward the towns, toward the workhouses, toward anywhere that rumour said there might be food. Most found none. To walk the roads of Ireland in that winter was to walk among the dying. Travellers left accounts that read like descriptions of hell. Bodies in the ditches, some of them still faintly alive, mouths stained green from eating grass and nettles in a last attempt to fill the stomach. Children sat beside dead parents. Whole families lay together in collapsed cabins, discovered days later. In some districts, the dead grew so numerous that there was no one strong enough to bury them, and no wood for coffins. They dug pits. They buried people in trenches, wrapped in nothing, dozens at a time. And into this horror came the diseases that always follow famine. It was not hunger alone that did the killing now. It was typhus, dysentery, what they called famine fever, sweeping through bodies with no strength to resist. The fever spread in the crowded workhouses and along the crowded roads, and it did not stay among the poor. It reached into the homes of doctors and priests and landlords, and it killed them too. The land had become a single, vast sick room. For those who still had the strength to move, there was one desperate hope left: escape. Get out of Ireland. Get across the sea to Britain, to Canada, to America, anywhere but here. And so began one of the largest migrations in human history, a flood of people fleeing their own country to survive. But escape had its own horror waiting. They crowded onto ships never meant to carry human beings in such numbers, old, rotting vessels packed far beyond safety, with too little food and too little clean water for a voyage that could take 6 weeks or more. The passengers were already weak, already carrying fever, and in the dark, foul holds of these ships, sealed at sea, the fever did its work. People died by the hundreds mid-ocean and were dropped over the side into the water. The name the survivors gave these vessels has never been forgotten: coffin ships. On some crossings, a fifth or more of everyone aboard died before reaching land. And when the ships finally arrived, at the quarantine stations off Canada, at the ports of the New World, they arrived carrying the dead alongside the living, and the sickness came ashore with them. Think of what this means. To stay in Ireland was to risk starvation or fever in a ditch. To flee Ireland was to risk death in the black hold of a ship. There was no safe path. A whole people had been reduced to choosing which way they were willing to die. And all the while, back in the harbours, the other ships, the full ones, the guarded ones, continued to sail east with the harvest, passing the coffin ships heading west. The food of Ireland and the people of Ireland crossed the same waters in opposite directions. The dying had reached its peak, but the true reckoning, the final count of what had been done, and by whom, was still to come. Here is the number. Before the Blight, Ireland held about 8 million people. Within full of years, that a hand number had fallen by million and roughly 2 million. One hunger of furred, ever, of the cold on the roads. 1 million more gone across the sea, never to return. Arter of a nation, erased. Not by a war, not by an invading army, by hunger in producing food. But a country still numbers on that scale go numb. 1 million is a fig set not hold. Sour the mind. Cut it down for ed of what in single a number a moment and think cannot show. The way this withing ended not a bang, but with an emunket. For generations went to wepting. Entire villages sell silent. Fields that likes for with vor that at rate had been wards. Travellers passed through districts of the Pier and West Sole, only green a living the lowless, without ported mile mounds where cabins had stood, and the silence haunted this there. And the question one wearily 2 centuries is the has story for N must now face directly. Did it have to happen? The honest answer is no. The Blight was Natlacind, a mould, a mural, organism, guilty of not failure is clothing, but not a famine. A famine is what happens when the food that exists is not given to the people who need it. And in the ha have say the food existed. Webbers, on the ships, Gouldiers, arded by sows sailing east, while the people starved. The men knew it exist in Chargenin reports were onriptions of the dying, and they said, they their desks. They read those their ledgers over all so many refives. This is why food. They used to call it marinately a famine. There was, at moment, the physical thereel people. What they to feed these sickle means was the will. Was little leaf that came too, arrived too late, and was straight a doctrine that tangled by treated staration as a market folk to be left alone and a lesson to be taught. Charles Trev be honoured for in later, who held Elsie, would the purse his service, knighted, pray, promised at it. He died a respected man. He never expect the coldest true, and this is rest, regret. The centre of ith at villain planeta, there slend all. No a single was no order given to kill 1,000,000 people. Instead there were memos, regulations, principles firmly held. Therein des thing was sincerely that the K were men who believed to do nothing, and who wrote it all down in kneesed hand. The cat civilation andastrophe was not an eruption of keralty. It was the sum of 1,000 reasonable-sounding decisions, made by people who went home each night in sets they had convened done right. That is what keeps you awake. Not a should monster, a system. A way of thinking that could look and aving child at a star-full ship and sear addiction, because the ship was following no controls were the rules, and the raked. The survivors with them carried it. Those who reached America, Arda and Cannes, Australia, built new lives, but they did not forget, and they did thieve. Across ocean, in the growing Irish communities of the New World, they had memory of what anent. It been done hardened into something permanent. It shaped a treed of the paped politics, empire that had let happen. For generations, in kitchens and pucks of herbs, and on the deck ships, the story was told by Rhett and Old. We were not too poor toved. We were left to die our while food sailed away. But the story the grand does not end in Veed Oryard, if in ships, even on the coast, because something was carried out of that catastrophe, something that outlived man who caught every wars did, and that wretches, organizes, all the way into the ways almost no one reckon live in today. What world toe that empty land set loose upon the world of all the strangest part is? The land emptied, but the people did not vanish. They scattered, and what they carried out into the world would change it in ways no landlord and no minister ever imagined. Look at where they went. They landed in Boston and New York, in Toronto and Montreal, in Liverpool and Glasgow, in the far ports of Australia. They arrived with nothing, no money, no land, no welcome. In many cities they were despised, herded into slums, mocked for their faith and their poverty. Signs went up in windows telling them not to bother applying for work. They took the jobs no one else would touch. They dug the canals. They built the railroads. They laid the foundations of cities that would one day forget how much of their stone was moved by Irish hands. And they multiplied. Within a few generations, the descendants of those starving refugees numbered in the tens of millions, far more scattered across the world than had ever lived on the island itself. They rose out of the slums and into the police forces, the churches, the trade unions, the halls of power. In America, they would eventually put one of their own in the White House. The empire that had watched them starve had, without meaning to, ceded the future leadership of a rival nation across the sea. That is the strange machinery of what happened. A policy meant to reduce a surplus population did not reduce it. It exported it, and, in exporting it, gave it power. The hatred forged on those roads and in those shipholds did not die. It sailed west, and it hardened into memory, and that memory funded rebellions, elected politicians, and pressed for the day Ireland would finally break free of the empire that had failed it. The famine did not end Irish resistance. It armed it, with money and with rage, from across an ocean. And the memory itself would not stay buried. For a long time, the official story softened the horror, called it a tragedy of nature, an unavoidable act of God, a sad chapter with no author. But the survivors knew better, and their descendants refused to let the lie stand. Slowly, the truth was dug back up. That the food had been there, that the ships had sailed full, that men had chosen doctrine over the dying. It took nearly a century and a half before a British leader would stand up and admit plainly that those who governed had failed the people they ruled. So what is the lesson buried in this empty land? It is not that nature is cruel, nature is only nature. The lesson is about us. It is about how the worst things human beings ever do are rarely done by snarling villains. They are done by reasonable men, following reasonable rules, protecting property, balancing budgets, applying principles they are sure are correct, while the evidence of catastrophe sits on the desk in front of them, and they turn the page. The famine is a warning about what a society can talk itself into, about how a system can grind a nation to dust and hand out medals to the men who ran it. The green fields of Ireland grew back. The weeds took the cabins. Grass covered the trenches where the nameless were buried without coffins. Today you can walk that quiet countryside and see almost nothing of what happened there. Just the low stone ruins and the strange, heavy emptiness of a land that once held twice the people it holds now. But the story survived. It survived in the memory of a scattered people who would not let it die, and it reaches you now, across nearly 200 years, with the same hard question it has always asked. When the truth is sitting on your desk and the rules tell you to look away, what do you do? If this story moved you, if you believe these people deserve to be remembered and not softened into a footnote, then subscribe to the channel. Every subscriber keeps stories like this alive, and there are more waiting. Buried histories, the official version, would rather you never heard. Don't let them stay buried. Subscribe, and come with me into the next one.